Mabel Truitt leaned across the counter of Hendrick's General Store and looked Ruby Holloway up and down, the way a person examines something they found stuck to the bottom of their boot. "Lord Ruby," she said, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "you get any bigger and we're going to have to start charging you for 2 seats at the social." She laughed first, always did, and then the others joined in because that's how cruelty works in a small town. One person sets the match, and the rest just watch it burn. "Honestly, I don't know why you keep coming in here. Nobody wants to look at you. Nobody ever will." Ruby's hands tightened around the paper in her fist. Her father's supply list, written in the shaking hand of a man who couldn't hold a pencil steady anymore. She didn't move, didn't speak. She'd learned a long time ago that reacting only made it worse. If you've ever stood in a room where everyone is laughing at you, and you had nowhere to go and no one to turn to, you know exactly what Ruby Holloway felt in that moment. This is the story of a woman the whole town buried, and how she rose anyway. Like this video if you believe a woman's worth was never in her size. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and follow along, because what happens next in Black Ridge will shake you to your core. The summer Ruby turned 24, she stopped counting the days by the calendar and started counting them by how much water the orchard still needed and how many times her father woke in the night coughing. Black Ridge, Montana sat at the base of a granite ridge that blocked the western sun 2 hours before it should have set, which meant the town lived half its life in early shadow. In winter, that shadow was unbearable. In summer, it was merely inconvenient. The people who stayed were the kind who decided inconvenience was as good as it was going to get. The Holloway orchard sat 3 miles outside of town on 40 acres of river-bottom soil that Ruby's grandfather had broken with his own hands. He'd planted the first apple trees himself, and her father had spent 30 years learning what the old man had been too stubborn to teach: how to graft a sick limb, how to read the soil when it needed iron, how to coax fruit from a dry summer by managing the waterways with a precision that looked like instinct but was actually years of painful failure. He'd written all of it down in a series of notebooks with cracked leather covers that Ruby now slept beside like they were sacred. She'd been reading those notebooks since she was 9. By 14, she could identify root rot by the way a tree dropped leaves. By 18, she'd redesigned the irrigation channels so thoroughly that her father had stood back and looked at her with an expression she only later recognized as awe. He never said he was proud of her. That wasn't his way. But he stopped second-guessing her, and for Thomas Holloway, that was everything. Now he was 61 years old, and his lungs were filling with something the doctor in Black Ridge called a persistent inflammation, and charged them $40 to name without curing. Thomas spent most days in the chair by the window, watching the orchard through glass, giving instructions in a voice that kept getting quieter. Ruby wrote them down in the same notebook style her father used because she was terrified of the day when the instructions would stop. She didn't let herself think past that. There wasn't room. The trip to Hendrick's General Store happened every 2 weeks on Fridays, because Friday was when the supply wagon from Billings came through and the shelves were freshest. Ruby needed copper sulfate for the dormant spray, twine for the training wire, and a particular grade of grafting wax that Old Man Hendricks ordered specially because no one else in the territory bothered with it. He'd started carrying it because Thomas Holloway asked him to 15 years ago. He kept carrying it because Ruby never missed a month. What Ruby didn't need, but couldn't avoid, was Mabel Truitt. Mabel was the wife of Judge Harlan Truitt, which in Black Ridge meant she was approximately the second most powerful person in the county and the most socially dangerous. She was 53, thin in the way that looks like discipline from a distance, and cruelty up close, and she had built her entire identity around the maintenance of a social order that placed her at the center of everything that mattered. She noticed every deviation from that order the way a spider notices vibration, instantly and with intent. She'd started in on Ruby about 4 years ago, after Ruby's mother died, and Ruby had stopped coming to the women's auxiliary meetings. Before that, she'd merely been condescending. After that, she'd sharpened into something with an edge. The morning Ruby walked into Hendrick's with her father's list folded in her coat pocket, Mabel was already holding court near the bolt fabric. Three other women arranged around her like she was the sun and they were the lesser planets. Ruby kept her eyes on the back counter and walked toward it. She almost made it. Ruby Holloway. Mabel's voice carried the way a school teacher's does, trained for rooms designed to be heard. I swear you get wider every month. Is it grief, do you think? Or is it just... She paused and looked at the other women, and Ruby could hear the smile in it without turning around. Just how things are going to be. Ruby put her list on the counter. Afternoon, Walt. Walt Hendricks was a small man with a deeply lined face and the survival instinct of someone who'd lived next to a rattlesnake long enough to learn not to poke it. He took the list without a word and began moving toward the shelves. She's ignoring me, Mabel said behind her, to the room. Now that's something. Ruby Holloway, who can't get a man to look at her twice, ignoring people. You'd think she'd be grateful for the attention. The other women laughed. One of them, Ruby recognized the voice as Caroline Marsh, whose daughter had once been Ruby's closest friend, laughed the hardest. That was the part that stayed with Ruby, not the insult. The laughter of someone she'd once trusted. What is it you're always buying in here, anyway? Mabel moved closer, and Ruby could hear the heels of her shoes on the wood floor. Farming supplies? Is that what your life is, Ruby? Farming supplies and taking care of a dying old man? That's it? Ruby's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes forward. I'm not saying it to be cruel, Mabel said, which was what people always said before they twisted the knife. I just think it must be very hard. Being you, no husband, no prospects, no... Another pause, deliberate as a surgeon's cut. No real future to speak of. Walt came back with two of the items and set them on the counter. He didn't look up. Your father's still with us? Mabel asked. The tone had shifted into something that mimicked sympathy so closely that a stranger might have been fooled. I heard he's gotten quite bad. The lungs, is it? That must be... It must be devastating watching that. Watching someone just... She exhaled. Diminish. Something moved in Ruby's chest that she hadn't expected. Not anger. Something rawer than anger. Something that had to do with the nights she sat beside her father's bed and counted his breaths and listened to the silence between them for the word he could never quite say. She turned around. It surprised Mabel. That was clear. The woman took half a step back. My father, Ruby said quietly, built the best orchard in Cascade County from 40 acres of rock and river clay. He did it with his hands and his mind and 20 years of work that nobody in this town ever noticed or asked about. You want to call that diminishing, Mabel? You go right ahead. She turned back to the counter. The silence was brief. Well, Mabel said, and her voice had taken on the particular warmth of someone who had been challenged and was now preparing to level everything in reach. I think we all know what Thomas Holloway's orchard is worth right now, and I think we all know what it'll be worth the day he's gone, which, from what I hear, won't be long. Ruby's hand went flat on the counter. You're going to lose that place, Mabel said. And then what? You'll be a big, plain, unmarried woman with no land, no family, no future, walking into stores like this one and wondering why nobody looks at you. At least now you've got property to explain the visits. The laughter that came from the group this time wasn't the surprised laugh from before. It was the settled laugh, the comfortable kind, the kind that meant they all agreed. The door opened. Nobody heard it over the laughter, or if they heard it, they didn't think to register it. Ruby heard it because she was facing the counter and the draft hit the back of her neck. That's enough. The voice was low. Not loud. It didn't need to be loud. It had the quality of something that had never needed to raise itself because it had never once been ignored. The laughter stopped the way sounds stop when something unexpected enters a room and the air pressure changes. Ruby turned slowly. He was standing just inside the doorway, hat still on, coat dusty from the road. Tall, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had seen weather and kept no record of minding it. He was looking directly at Mabel Truitt with an expression that was not angry so much as extremely, precisely still. Ruby had never seen him before. She was certain of that. She would have remembered. I said that's enough, he repeated into the silence. Then he looked at the women assembled around Mabel, and he held the look long enough to be uncomfortable. Every one of you. Mabel opened her mouth. Mrs. Truitt. He knew her name. That surprised her into silence. I've done business with your husband for 6 years. I have never once made his life difficult. I'd appreciate it if you'd consider returning that courtesy by conducting yourself like someone worth the space you're taking up in a room. The quality of the silence changed entirely. Mabel's face had gone through 3 shades of color in the span of 5 seconds. Her mouth opened and closed, and nothing came out, which was probably the first time that had happened in a decade. He crossed the store, nodded briefly at Walt behind the counter, then turned to Ruby. Up close, his eyes were the gray-green of water in a river after it's rained. He was older than he'd looked from across the room, mid-40s maybe, with lines around the eyes that hadn't come from smiling. You have everything you need? He asked her. Just that. Ruby looked at him for a moment. There was something disorienting about being spoken to that way, directly, without the extra weight people usually loaded into words when they talked to her. Just a question, asked plainly. Almost, she said. He nodded and stepped back to give her room at the counter, because that was evidently all he'd wanted to know. She turned back to Walt. Walt was staring at the stranger with an expression that suggested he had witnessed something he would be describing to his wife for the next week and a half. He assembled the rest of the order in near silence. Behind her, Ruby heard the heels on the wood floor retreating. The door opened and shut. The remaining women murmured something among themselves and then dispersed the way smaller birds do when a hawk shows up, quickly and without making a production of it. The store went quiet. Ruby paid for the supplies and picked up the parcels. The stranger was examining a wall of tack near the window, hands in his coat pockets, not looking at her. Thank you, she said, because not saying it seemed like a different kind of smallness than she wanted to practice. He turned. I've been through this town about a dozen times, he said. Never enjoyed it much. Today I understand why. He looked at her with that same level directness. Wyatt Granger. I run the Double G out past the Tanner Creek Bend. She'd heard the name. Everyone had. The Double G was the largest cattle operation in the north end of the county. 1,000 acres, or near enough to it, that had been built up fast in the last 8 years and was still expanding. She'd assumed Wyatt Granger was someone her father's age or older. Ruby Holloway, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, but enough to notice. Thomas Holloway's daughter. You know him? I know his apples. He said it without irony. My cook buys from your orchard every fall. Best eating apples in the territory, she says. Won't hear of buying from anywhere else. Ruby almost smiled. She'd heard her father's trees described a lot of ways over the years. Commercially marginal, nostalgically viable. Not the kind of operation a serious man would put money into. She'd never heard them called simply the best. The Gravensteins, she said. Those would be the ones. My grandfather planted the originals. My father kept them alive when they got the blight in '78. Took him 3 years to bring them back. Wyatt nodded like that meant something to him. I heard you've been running it mostly yourself this past year. Who told you that? He looked slightly uncomfortable. Walt, maybe. I don't remember exactly. People talk. People in this town talk about everything except what matters, she said. That's true of most towns. He picked up his hat, turned it once in his hands. I hope your father gets some easier days. He said it without the performance that people usually wrapped around condolences. No head tilt, no softened voice. Just the words, directly. Ruby picked up her parcels. So do I. She walked out into the afternoon, into the shadow of the ridge that had already started its early creep across the street, and she didn't look back. But she was aware, in a way she couldn't quite name and didn't want to examine yet, that for the first time in recent memory, she'd walked out of Hendrick's General Store without the particular heaviness that usually followed her through the door and down the road and all the way home. The wagon sat where she'd left it, the horse patient and dull-eyed in the heat. She loaded the parcels carefully, climbed up, clucked the horse forward, and turned east toward the orchard. She was half a mile out of town before she allowed herself to wonder, briefly, whether Wyatt Granger meant what he said about passing through Black Ridge a dozen times, and whether, having said what he'd said to Mabel Truitt in front of half the town's social network, His business in the county might get considerably more complicated starting today. That was his concern, not hers. She had grafting wax and copper sulfate and 20 acres of trees that needed attention before the end of the week. She had a father who needed his dinner at 5 o'clock and his medications at 7, and someone to sit with him after, when the coughing got bad and the night stretched long. She had exactly no room in her life for the kind of thinking she was currently doing. She told herself that firmly. Then the horse crested the low hill above the river bottom, and she could see the orchard spread below her in the late afternoon light, the rows of trees heavy with the earliest summer apples, the irrigation channels glinting copper at the edges, the old farmhouse with its smoke coming up thin from the chimney, and the ache in her chest shifted from something painful into something complicated, the way grief does when it's mixed with love that has nowhere else to go. Thomas Holloway had built this. She was holding it. Whatever else happened in Black Ridge, whatever people said or laughed or decided to believe about Ruby Holloway and what she was worth, this was here, real, and it was going to stay here. She was going to make certain of that. The wagon rolled down the hill toward home, and she let herself breathe for the first time since she'd walked into Hendrick's that morning. 3 miles behind her, in the doorway of the general store, Wyatt Granger stood with his hat in his hands and watched the wagon disappear over the ridge, and he stood there a moment longer than made any particular practical sense. Then he went back inside and finished his business and tried to remember what he'd come to Black Ridge for in the first place. It took him a minute. That bothered him more than he was willing to admit. He rode out to the orchard 3 days later. Ruby heard the horse before she saw the rider. Hoof beats on the dry road that ran along the river bottom, coming from the direction of town at a steady pace that wasn't urgent and wasn't casual either. She was on the irrigation ladder checking the upper channel where the 3rd row of Gravensteins got their water, and she didn't climb down. She just watched. Wyatt Granger rode a dark bay gelding that was better than anything she'd seen in Black Ridge's hitching posts, long-legged and clean-moving, with the kind of quiet that came from being handled correctly from the beginning. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the orchard the way her father used to look at it before his lungs got bad, like he was reading something. Then he looked up and found her on the ladder, and he didn't seem surprised. "Miss Holloway." "Mr. Granger." She came down 2 rungs, but not all the way. "You're a long way from the Tanner Creek Bend." "About 12 miles, he said. "I've ridden further for less reason." She came the rest of the way down and wiped her hands on her work trousers. She was wearing her father's old canvas coat because the morning was still cold, and it was the most practical thing she owned, and she was aware that she looked nothing like a woman receiving a visitor. She decided not to care. "You came to see the orchard," she said. It wasn't a question. "I came to talk to you," he said. The orchard was part of it. She opened the gate. He dismounted, tied the gelding to the post, and followed her in without being asked twice. They walked the 1st row without speaking. She watched him the way she watched anyone who walked her orchard for the first time, looking for what they noticed, what they passed without seeing, where their eyes went first. Wyatt Granger looked at the trees. Not at the fruit, though some of the early varieties were already sizing up nicely. He looked at the structure, the way the branches were trained, the angle of the grafts on the older rootstock. He stopped once and crouched down to look at the soil around a base, and she saw him press 2 fingers into the ground and feel the moisture level. "Your irrigation's deep fed," he said. "My grandfather put in the original channels. My father redesigned them in '77 after a drought year nearly took everything. I reworked the gradient last spring." She paused. "We lose less to evaporation than any other orchard I've seen documented." He stood up and looked at her. "You documented others?" "I write to the agricultural station in Helena. They send me reports. I send them data." She shrugged one shoulder. "They don't take me as seriously as they'd take my father. But they answer." He was quiet for a moment. "How long has he been unable to work the land?" 14 months since he could do a full day. 8 months since he stopped going out at all." She said it flatly, because that was the only way to say it without it taking over the conversation entirely. "I have 2 hired hands for heavy labor, brothers. They do what I tell them, and they do it right. The knowledge work is mine." Wyatt nodded slowly. He was looking down the row, calculating something she couldn't see yet. "What are you here to say, Mr. Granger?" she asked. Because you don't strike me as a man who rides 12 miles to look at another person's soil moisture. He turned to face her directly. I want to propose a business arrangement. She waited. I have cattle and I have land, he said, and what I don't have is anything growing on that land that isn't grass. I've been running beef for 8 years and it's profitable, but it's precarious. One bad winter, one disease year, one market shift, and I'm looking at serious loss. I want to diversify. He glanced back down the row of trees. I've been thinking about orcharding for 2 years. I didn't know where to start. And you think you can learn it from me? I think you could teach someone, he said. Whether you'd want to teach me is a different question. Ruby looked at him for a long moment. The morning light had moved and was now hitting the orchard at an angle that made everything look more generous than it was, and she didn't trust generous light. What's the arrangement? She said. You teach me cultivation, the real knowledge, the grafting, the soil management, the irrigation design, not general farming, the specific expertise you've built here. In exchange, I bring 4 of my men to work this orchard through the harvest season. Full hands. They do what you say, when you say it. No argument, no renegotiation. Ruby was quiet. Your harvest is 8-9 weeks out, he said. You're short-handed and you know it. I've got men who work hard and follow direction. You've got knowledge that took 3 generations to build and a season that won't wait. And after harvest? She said. What do you get after harvest? A working knowledge I can apply to my own land. And, he said with a slight pause, a fair price on whatever quantity of rootstock and grafting material you're willing to sell me in the spring. It was a clean offer. She could see that. No charity disguised as business, no condescension wrapped in generosity. He was telling her plainly what he needed and what he was offering and letting her do the arithmetic herself. That was rare enough that it almost made her suspicious. You could hire an agricultural consultant from Helena, she said, someone with credentials. I could, he said. I looked into it. The consultants from Helena have book knowledge. You have something different. He glanced at the graft unions on the nearest tree, the way they'd healed clean without callous overgrowth. That's not something anyone teaches you in a classroom. She pulled her coat closer and looked at the orchard, her father's orchard, her grandfather's orchard. And she thought about the harvest coming in 8 weeks, and the 2 Garrity brothers who were good workers, but not enough workers, and the rows still needing thinning in the upper section, and the early drop that had started in the Cortlands that worried her. I need to tell you something before you decide this is simple, she said. The people in this town are going to have opinions about you being out here, about you and me working together. What you said to Mabel Truitt, that follows a person in a town this size. I know that. It'll affect your business. Judge Truitt controls the water rights allocation on the South Fork. If he decides to make things difficult for the Ruby. He said her first name without seeming to notice he'd done it, and then he noticed, and the slight pause that followed was the most human thing she'd seen from him. Harlan Truitt controls the water rights. He doesn't control me. I've dealt with men like him before. It's not the part I'm worried about. What part are you worried about? He was quiet for 2 seconds longer than felt comfortable. Whether you'll take me seriously as a student, I'm not an easy man to teach. I've been running my own operation long enough that I have habits, and some of them are probably wrong. And I'm not always good at hearing that. She hadn't expected him to say that. She hadn't expected the specific honesty of it. Not just humility as a tactic, but the plain acknowledgement of a real flaw. No, she said. You probably aren't. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Is that a yes? It's a consideration, she said. Come back Thursday. I'll show you the upper section and tell you what we're facing with the harvest. If you still think the arrangement makes sense after you've seen all of it, we'll talk terms. He nodded once. Thursday. He untied the gelding, mounted cleanly, and rode back down the gate road without looking back. She watched him go. Then she climbed back up the ladder and went back to work, and spent the rest of the morning trying not to think about the offer, because thinking about it made her feel something that was uncomfortably close to hope. And hope was expensive in a season this tight. Thursday came dry and bright, the kind of Montana morning that lies about how warm it's going to stay. Wyatt showed up at 6:45. which was earlier than she'd told him and exactly the right time. She gave him a shovel and put him to work alongside her on the drainage trench in the upper section before she said more than 20 words to him, because she wanted to see how he handled labor he hadn't been asked to do. He handled it without complaint and without performance. He dug where she pointed, asked one question about angle that was a good question, and didn't talk when he didn't need to. By mid-morning, she'd shown him the Cortland rose with the early drop problem. She explained what she thought was happening, a subtle mineral deficiency showing up in the smallest fruit, exacerbated by the dry stretch in June. And she watched his face while she talked, looking for the expression that meant he was waiting for her to finish rather than actually listening. He was actually listening. "What would you do about it?" she asked when she'd finished explaining. He thought for a moment. "Foliar spray with something that addresses the deficiency directly. That's the obvious answer." "And the problem with the obvious answer? The fruit's too close to harvest. Foliar spray at this stage risks residue and can affect flavor in ways you won't catch until after you've sold it." She picked up a dropped apple and showed him the lenticel marking on the skin. "I'm going to adjust the water delivery. Increase frequency, shorter duration for the next 3 weeks. Addresses the uptake problem without touching the fruit directly." He looked at the apple in her hand. "That's not in any agricultural manual I've read." "No," she said. "It's in my father's notebook from 1881. He figured it out the year we nearly lost the Cortland block entirely." She set the apple down. "That's what you're paying for, Mr. Granger, not what's in the manuals." He met her eyes. "I understand that now." The terms took another hour to work out, sitting at the kitchen table in the farmhouse with cups of coffee that Ruby made too strong and didn't apologize for. They went back and forth on a few points. Wyatt wanted the rootstock price fixed ahead of time. Ruby wanted the option to renegotiate based on yield. They found a middle position that neither of them loved, which meant it was probably fair. She wrote it all down in plain language, 2 copies, and they both signed. Thomas Holloway watched from his chair by the window. He'd been awake when Wyatt arrived and had said nothing, and Ruby had introduced them briefly and let her father take the measure of the man in his own time. Now, as they were finishing, her father spoke. "You're Granger," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Wyatt had crossed the room when Thomas spoke and was standing where the old man could see him without turning his head. "I've heard about your operation." Thomas's voice was thin, but the intelligence in it hadn't gone anywhere. "You pushed a lot of small ranchers out when you were building up the Double G." Wyatt didn't flinch. "Some of them, yes. I bought land at fair market. Whether it was fair to the people selling is a more complicated question." Thomas looked at him for a long time. "My daughter's the best grower in this county," he said. "She's better than I was at her age. Better than I ever was, if I'm being honest." He said it the way men of his generation said difficult truths, quietly, into the middle distance, not quite at the person they were saying it to. "I want to make sure you understand that before you go telling her what to do on her own land." "Mr. Holloway," Wyatt said, "she's already told me what to do on her land. I dug a drainage trench this morning because she pointed and said, 'Dig, that's where we stand.'" Something moved in Thomas's face. He looked back out the window. "Good," he said, and that was all. The 4 ranch hands arrived the following Monday morning, 2 brothers named Pete and Carl Dawson who were compact and efficient and said almost nothing, a younger man called Fenn who was enthusiastic to the point of occasional uselessness until Ruby gave him a specific task, and an older hand named Dix who'd been with Wyatt 8 years and had the slow, careful movements of someone who'd learned to pace himself across long seasons. Ruby assessed them in the first 2 hours and assigned them work according to what she saw, not what they told her they were good at. Dix, she put on the thinning. He was patient and his hands were gentle, and he didn't rush. The Dawsons went on the irrigation maintenance, which required more strength than finesse. Fenn she kept near herself because he needed supervision, but he learned fast and he was going to be useful once he understood that enthusiasm wasn't the same as productivity. Wyatt worked with her directly, most days. It was uncomfortable at first, not between them exactly, but in the general atmosphere of the orchard. The Garrity brothers, her original hired hands, were polite to the newcomers, in the careful way of men who aren't sure what their status is anymore. Ruby handled it by being explicit. The Garritys were senior hands, They knew the land. The Double G men deferred to their knowledge. That settled it within 2 days. What didn't settle as quickly was the town. She heard about it secondhand through Walt Hendricks, who told her without being asked because Walt operated on the principle that information shared is trouble prevented. Mabel Truitt had spoken at the Women's Auxiliary about the impropriety of a single woman conducting private business with an unmarried man, particularly at a remote property, particularly given, and here Mabel had apparently gestured in a way that completed the sentence without words. Judge Truitt had said something at the Stockmen's Association meeting about Wyatt's judgment. There had been talk about whether the Double G's grazing permits, which came up for renewal in the fall, might face some administrative delay. Wyatt, when Ruby told him, showed no visible reaction for a moment. Then he said, "How much is Harlan Truitt's support worth to you? On average, in practical terms." "Nothing," she said. "He's never given me any." "Then we haven't lost anything." He went back to what he'd been doing, which was practicing the grafting technique she'd shown him earlier. His first 3 attempts had been slightly wrong in the same way, too much pressure at the union, and he was trying it again. "What about you? How are you holding up with it?" She looked at him. "I've been holding up with it my whole life." He looked up from the graft. Something in his face changed in a way that was hard to name. Not pity, which she would have recognized and resisted, but something more like a specific kind of anger that had nowhere to go. "That's not an answer," he said. "That's a deflection." She was quiet. "You don't have to be fine with it," he said. "Just because you've endured it doesn't mean it's endurable." Nobody had said that to her. Not in those words, not with that directness. Her father loved her, but he was of a generation that expressed love through provision and presence, not language. Her friends, the ones she'd had before time and circumstance had worn those relationships down, had mostly advised her to ignore it, which was useful advice in the way that advice to ignore a broken arm was useful. "I'm not fine with it," she said after a moment. "I'm used to it. That's different." "Yes," he said. "It is." He went back to the graft. She went back to her work, but something had shifted in the air between them, some small rearrangement that neither of them acknowledged or needed to. The days got into a rhythm. She was up before first light, running the water checks and reviewing the previous day's notes. Wyatt arrived by 7 most mornings, sometimes earlier. They did the technical work together, the close observation, the decisions about which trees needed intervention, the grafting practice she was walking him through systematically. And she watched his understanding develop in real time, which was genuinely interesting to her because he didn't learn the way she'd expected. She'd expected him to be impatient. He wasn't impatient. He was thorough to the point of stubbornness. He asked more questions than she'd anticipated, and most of them were good questions, the kind that came from someone actually trying to understand the underlying system rather than just the surface technique. He made mistakes. He killed 3 young grafts in the first week by misjudging the cambium alignment, and he came to her directly and told her, and she showed him what had gone wrong without softening it, and he didn't argue with her assessment. She respected that. What she hadn't anticipated was the way working beside someone day after day stripped away the performance that people maintained around each other. By the end of the 2nd week, she knew that Wyatt took his coffee without sugar and didn't like it discussed before he'd been awake an hour. She knew he had a younger sister in Wyoming he'd written a letter to and hadn't sent yet. She knew the Double G had almost gone under in its 3rd year and that he'd sold his horse, his personal horse, not the working stock, to cover a debt, and that this still bothered him in a way he hadn't meant to tell her, and had told her anyway in a moment of tiredness one evening when they were going over the harvest schedule. She knew because he told her at a point in the 3rd week when they were treating a section of fire blight and the work was repetitive enough to let words come loose, that his wife had died 5 years ago. Fever, fast and final. He said it the way Ruby talked about her father's illness, with the practiced flatness of someone who had said it enough times to know that the saying of it never got easier, only quieter. She told him about her mother. Not all of it, but the part that mattered, that her mother had been the one who first read her the agricultural reports from the station in Helena when Ruby was 10, and had taken them seriously as reading material the same way she'd have taken seriously a novel or a newspaper. That her mother had believed, specifically and practically, that Ruby's mind was worth educating. that without that particular belief, applied in those particular years, none of the rest of it would have happened. Wyatt listened. He didn't try to summarize it or respond to it with something equivalent. He just listened, and then he said, "She was right," and they went back to work. The trouble from town materialized on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, and it came in a form Ruby hadn't entirely expected. She was in the barn with Fen, working through the storage preparation for early harvest, when she heard a wagon on the road. She came to the barn door and saw it wasn't a wagon she recognized. A well-kept rig, with a man she didn't know driving and a man she did know sitting beside him. Gerald Fitch was the county land assessor. He was a small, colorless man who wore the same expression in all conditions, which was the expression of someone doing arithmetic in his head. He climbed down from the wagon and looked at the farmhouse, and then at Ruby in the barn doorway with the same lack of effect. "Miss Holloway, I'm here for the annual property assessment." "Annual assessment isn't until October," she said. "The schedule's been adjusted." He said it without a hint of apology. "Adjusted by who?" "The county assessor's office." He pulled a paper from his coat. "Routine reassessment of agricultural properties in the North Precinct. Nothing irregular." She looked at the paper. She was not a lawyer, but she'd read enough documents, contracts, water rights filings, the land deed her father kept in a tin box under the floorboard, to know what a rush document looked like versus one with real procedural backing. This one was real enough. The date of authorization was 3 weeks ago, which meant it had been set in motion around the time Wyatt had shown up at her gate. "Fine," she said. "I'll show you the property." Wyatt was in the upper section and saw the assessor's rig from the rise. He came down without being summoned, which Ruby noticed, and he stood back while Fitch walked the orchard and made his notations, and he didn't say anything. But he was there, which meant there was a witness, which she was fairly certain was why he'd come down. Fitch was thorough and impersonal and left an hour later. The man with the rig didn't say a word the whole time. That evening, after the hands had gone and the orchard was quiet, Ruby sat on the porch steps with the assessment form Fitch had left and read it 3 times. Wyatt sat on the step below her, which put him roughly at her eye level given his height, and he read it when she handed it to him. "He's flagged the irrigation infrastructure as a capital improvement," he said. "If they classify it that way, your taxable value increases." "I know." "Enough to affect you?" She thought about what was in the account at the Black Ridge Bank and what the harvest needed to bring in and what the winter would cost with the doctor coming more frequently now. "It could," she said, "depending on the rate." He handed the form back. "I know a lawyer in Billings who handles agricultural property. I could write to him." "I don't need you to solve this for me." "I know you don't." He said it without defensiveness. "I'm offering because the lawyer's good and because I want to, not because I think you can't handle it yourself. You can clearly handle it yourself. You've been handling things yourself for a long time." He paused. "That doesn't mean you have to handle everything alone." The evening was cooling down fast the way Montana evenings did, even in late summer, and the orchard had gone from green to gray in the fading light. She could hear one of the Garrity brothers closing up the equipment shed on the far side of the property. "Write to him," she said. "Tell him I'll pay his consultation fee." "Ruby?" "I'll pay his fee," she repeated. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." She stood up and brushed off her trousers and looked out at the dark shapes of the trees. Tomorrow was the beginning of the Gravenstein harvest, the first real harvest, the one that would tell her whether the season was what she thought it was going to be or something worse. She'd been watching the fruit for 2 weeks and she was confident, but confidence in an orchard was always a negotiation with things you couldn't control. "You should know," Wyatt said from the step, "that Harlan Truitt's grazing permit pressure isn't going to work. I've already filed the renewal paperwork through the Billings office rather than the county seat. Technically, within the rules. He can complain about it, but he can't block it." She looked down at him. "When did you do that?" "Week and a half ago." "Before the assessment." "I anticipated there'd be pressure," he said. "I didn't know what form it would take." She studied him in the low light. He was looking out at the orchard the same direction she'd been looking, his forearms on his knees, nothing performative about his posture. "You protected your own interests," she said. "That's what you did." Yes, he said. And yours. Both at once. Sometimes that's possible. She stood there with the assessment form in her hand and the orchard going dark around her, and she thought about what it meant to have someone stand next to you, not because they needed something from you in that moment, and not because they felt sorry for you, and not because they were performing decency for an audience, but simply because they'd decided to be there, and had made that decision quietly, and acted on it practically, and were now sitting on her porch step, looking at her father's trees in the dark. She didn't say anything about that. There wasn't a version of saying it that wouldn't make it smaller than it was. Early start tomorrow, she said instead. Gravenstein harvest starts at first light. He stood up. I'll be here before light. I know, she said, and went inside. The Gravenstein harvest took 11 days. Ruby had estimated 10, but the upper section ran slower than she'd planned because 3 of the trees had more fruit than her counts had shown. A good problem, the kind that meant extra hands working past the light and soreness in every muscle by nightfall. She didn't complain about it, neither did anyone else, which told her something about the crew Wyatt had brought. Dix turned out to be the best picker she'd ever worked alongside. He had the instinct for it, the angle of the wrist, the slight upward lift rather than pull, the way he read each fruit before he touched it, and never once bruised a Gravenstein. She told him so on the 4th day directly, without softening it, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who wasn't used to being told he was good at something by the person running the operation. My grandmother had an orchard, he said. Missouri, long time ago. It shows, she said, and moved on. Wyatt worked the middle rows, which was where the volumes were highest and the ladder work was most repetitive. He didn't complain about the ladder work. By the 3rd day, his technique had improved enough that she stopped checking behind him, which was the real measure. The nights were the hardest part. She'd come in after dark, cook something fast and plain for her father, sit with him while he ate, listen to his breathing, write the day's numbers in the harvest log. Some nights her hands shook from fatigue while she was writing, and she had to stop and wait. She didn't tell anyone about the shaking hands. There was no point. Thomas was following the harvest through the window and through her reports. He asked specific questions, yields per row, fruit sizing, any sign of the bitter pit that had plagued the Gravensteins in 2011, and she answered them precisely because that was what he wanted. Not reassurance. Data. On the 7th night, he said from his chair, without looking at her, This Granger, you trust him. It wasn't a question, but it had a question inside it. I trust his word, she said carefully. He does what he says he'll do. That's not what I asked. She set down the log. What are you asking? Thomas was quiet for a moment. The lamp threw his face into planes of yellow and shadow and made him look older than he was, or maybe just made visible what was already true. I'm asking if you trust him with more than the harvest, he said. She didn't answer right away. I don't know yet, she said. I'm paying attention. He nodded slowly, as if that was the right answer. Maybe it was. The Gravensteins came off clean, the best yield in 6 years, better than Ruby's own projections by 11%. When she wrote the final number in the log and added it up twice to be sure, she sat at the kitchen table for a full minute without moving. Then she went to the window and looked at the orchard in the dark and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the number didn't already say better. She told Wyatt the next morning. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was actually absorbing it rather than just reacting. 11% over projection on a stressed water year, he said. That's the irrigation adjustment. And the thinning schedule. And getting the early drop under control in time. She paused. And 4 extra hands for 11 days. He accepted that without making it into more than it was. What's next? Cortland's in 2 weeks? Then the Empires. Then we prep for winter. She looked at him. Your men have been good, Dix especially. I'll tell him. I already did. She handed him the harvest log. I want you to read the notes from the Cortland section. There's something I want your opinion on before I decide what to do. He looked up from the log. It was the first time she'd asked for his opinion on a cultivation decision, and he seemed to understand what that meant without her having to explain it. I'll read it tonight, he said. The annual Blackridge Social was held the 3rd Saturday of September, Every year without exception, in the community hall that sat at the end of Main Street and served as schoolroom, civic meeting space, and 3 times a year, a venue for the kind of collective gathering that frontier towns used to remind themselves they were still a community and not just a collection of stubborn individuals sharing a water source. Ruby had not attended in 4 years. She'd had reasons each time. The harvest, her mother's illness, her father's worsening condition, the simple accumulation of energy it cost to walk into a room where most of the people in it had, at some point, said something about her that she would have been better off not knowing. The social was where Black Ridge consolidated its opinions about itself and about the people in it, and Ruby had learned that the opinion Black Ridge held about her was not one she needed to witness up close. She had not intended to go this year either. It was Wyatt who brought it up, on a Wednesday, in the matter-of-fact tone he used for logistical questions. "The social's Saturday," he said. "I know when it is. Are you going?" She was silent. "Because I'm going," he said. "I have business to discuss with the Hennessy brothers about the South Pasture lease, and they'll be there." He was looking at the Cortland row they were assessing, not at her. "I thought I'd ask." "You're asking me to go to the social." "I'm telling you I'm going and asking if you want to go at the same time. Those are different things." He crouched down to look at the base of the nearest tree. "You don't have to." She thought about it for 2 days. She didn't tell herself she was thinking about it. She told herself she was focused on the pre-harvest preparation and the supply order and the letter from the Helena Agricultural Station that had arrived with a request for her irrigation data. But the social sat in the back of her mind the way an unresolved arithmetic problem does, nagging at the edge of everything else. On Friday evening, her father said from his chair, "Are you going tomorrow?" She stopped in the kitchen doorway. "How did you know about that?" "Dix mentioned it, in passing." He looked at her. "You should go." "Why?" "Because you've been hiding from that room for 4 years," he said, "and you're not someone who hides. You've just been pretending you are." He turned back to the window. "Go. Take the green dress your mother made you. It still fits." She started to say something about the green dress and thought better of it. Saturday was clear and cold in the way of early Montana fall, the sky a hard, brilliant blue that had no softness in it. She wore the green dress, which did still fit, and her good boots, and she put her hair up the way her mother had shown her, with the 2 pins at the back, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand for approximately 3 seconds before deciding that looking longer would not improve anything and that she was going anyway. Wyatt met her at the road. He'd ridden over, which meant he'd calculated the arrival timing, which meant he'd thought about it. He was wearing a clean coat and had done something with his hair that made him look more formal than she'd seen him. He looked at her the way he looked at the Gravenstein figures, taking in the information and processing it without performance. "Green suits you," he said. "Don't start," she said. "I wasn't starting anything," he said mildly. "I was observing." He offered his arm, which was a formal gesture that felt, in his hands, less like formality and more like a statement of position. She took it. The hall was full when they arrived. That was deliberate on her part. She'd timed it so there would be no prolonged entrance, so she'd simply be present in a room that was already in motion. It was a calculation her mother had taught her. If you walk in when everyone's already talking, you become part of the room. If you walk in first, you become the subject. It didn't entirely work. She felt the shift in the room when they came through the door. Not everyone noticed immediately, but the people who noticed first were the ones whose opinions moved fastest. And within 2 minutes, the subtle reorganization of attention had reached every corner of the hall. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not dramatic, just real. Wyatt noticed it too, and his jaw set slightly, and he steered them toward the Hennessy brothers without acknowledging the attention in any direction. That was the right move. She appreciated it. The Hennessys were straightforward men who talked about land and weather and were glad to see Wyatt and politely curious about Ruby in a way that wasn't unfriendly. She'd sold them apples for 3 years and they knew it, and Roy Hennessy said, "Best Cortlands in the territory, Miss Holloway. I won't buy from anyone else," with the directness of a man who wasn't interested in social calibration, and she was grateful for that. She was managing. That was the honest word for it. She was managing the room, the way she managed the orchard in a difficult season, taking it piece by piece, not looking at the whole. Mabel Truitt was at the far end of the hall with a group of women, and Ruby had been aware of her location since the moment they walked in, the way you're always aware of the thing in the room that has hurt you before. She lasted 40 minutes before Mabel crossed the room. She knew it was coming. She saw the angle of approach in her peripheral vision, and she kept talking to Agnes Carr, who was the school teacher and the most sensible person in Black Ridge, and who was telling her about the new primers she'd ordered from Helena, and she kept her face level and her voice steady. "Ruby Holloway," Mabel said, arriving beside them with two of her auxiliary women behind her like weather following a storm front. "I wouldn't have expected to see you here." "Evening, Mabel," Agnes said, with a particular dryness that Ruby had always admired. Mabel's eyes moved to Agnes briefly and then returned to Ruby. "I hope you're enjoying yourself, though I imagine it must be strange being in a social setting, given your circumstances." The pause was precisely placed. "Running a farm alone, keeping to yourself out there. Some people were saying you'd become quite the hermit." Ruby held her glass of cider and looked at Mabel and said nothing. "Of course, you're not entirely alone anymore, are you?" Mabel's voice had acquired the particular texture of someone making a point they've been holding for weeks. "Mr. Granger's been very attentive. Out at your property quite a lot, from what people say." She tilted her head. "I do hope it's all above board, for your reputation's sake, such as it is." The room near them had gone quiet in the incremental way of people who are pretending not to listen while listening completely. "Mabel," Wyatt's voice came from directly behind Ruby, and she hadn't heard him approach, and she felt rather than saw the room adjust to his presence. "I've been looking for the judge. Is he here tonight?" The question was perfectly bland, perfectly normal. It also communicated, without saying so, that he had heard every word. Mabel's composure flickered. Yes, he's near the back." "Good. I need to speak with him about the water rights renewal." Wyatt moved to stand beside Ruby. Not in front of her, not blocking her, just beside her. "Though, since you're here, there's something I'd like to address, if you'll allow it." Something in his tone had changed. Still quiet. But the quality of the quiet was different, the kind that precedes a declaration rather than a conversation. Mabel looked uncertain for the first time Ruby could recall. "Mr. Granger, this is hardly the place. I think it's exactly the place." He said it with a finality that wasn't aggressive but left no room. He looked around the hall, not theatrically, not for effect, just honestly, in the way of someone who's been deciding something and has now decided it. Several conversations nearby had stopped entirely. "I've been working with Ruby Holloway for 6 weeks, he said, in a voice that carried without being raised. "I've seen her manage an operation that most men in this county couldn't run on their best day. I've watched her solve problems her father's notebooks couldn't cover because she's moved past what he knew. I've watched her handle cruelty from this community with more dignity than this community deserves." He paused. Not for effect, to find the right words, which was different. "I want to say clearly, to anyone in this room who's had occasion to speak unkindly about her, you were wrong. About her capability, about her worth, about what she is." He stopped again, then, more quietly, "And I'm in love with her. That's not something I planned to say tonight, but I'm not going to stand in a room full of people and pretend otherwise." The hall had gone almost completely silent. Ruby's breath had stopped somewhere around the word love and hadn't resumed. Mabel Truitt's face had passed through several expressions and arrived at something that was more complex than she usually allowed herself in public. Ruby became aware, in the specific detail of a moment that is writing itself into permanent memory, of the grain of the wooden floor, the smell of the lamp oil, the sound of someone's boot shifting near the door, and Wyatt standing beside her looking at her with the expression she'd been trying to name for 6 weeks, and could now see clearly was the same expression he turned on her irrigation channels and her grafting technique and her father's notebooks, pure, uncomplicated attention. She had 2 options. She could say something careful and measured and socially intelligent that would manage the moment and leave everyone comfortable, or she could say what was true. Her mother had told her once that the moments when you choose comfort over truth are the moments you remember with the most regret. I wasn't planning to say anything like this tonight either, she said into the silence, and her voice was steadier than she felt. She was looking at Wyatt. But since you've started, she paused. You're an imperfect student and you killed 3 graphs in your first week and you asked too many questions before coffee. Something moved in his face. And I'm in love with you. I don't know what to do about that yet, but I'm not going to pretend it isn't true. Agnes Carr made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Somewhere at the back of the hall, someone started to speak and thought better of it. Mabel Truitt said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Well," and then said nothing else, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing that had happened all evening. Wyatt reached down and took her hand. Not a grand gesture, just a hand, finding hers and holding it. She let it. They stood there in the Black Ridge Community Hall with half the county watching, and she didn't hide, didn't soften, didn't perform the social calculation she'd been making her whole life. She just stood in the middle of the room she'd been avoiding for 4 years, in her mother's green dress, holding the hand of a man who'd said her name like it was a fact and not an insult. Judge Harlan Truitt materialized from the back of the hall with the careful walk of a large man trying to move quietly. He stopped beside his wife, assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 30 years reading rooms, and said nothing. Mabel said something low to him that Ruby couldn't hear. He shook his head once, slowly, and put his hand briefly on his wife's arm and steered her toward the refreshment table. The gesture had the quality of a man closing a door he'd left open too long. The room slowly, raggedly, found its way back to its own conversations. Agnes Carr moved next to Ruby and said, "I'm going to get more cider. Would you like some?" Which was Agnes's way of saying, "I'm proud of you, and I'm not going to make a fuss about it." And Ruby nodded and said yes, and Agnes disappeared toward the table. And Ruby released a breath she had been holding since approximately the moment Wyatt had started talking. "Was that," she said quietly to him, "too much?" "I was going to ask if it was planned." "No," he said. "I told you, I'm not always good at—" He stopped. "Some things I handle better than others." "I know," she said. "Are you angry?" She thought about it honestly. "No, I think I'm—" She searched for the word. "Exposed." He understood what she meant. She could see that. "I know. I'm sorry for that part." "Don't be," she said. "I'm not." And she found, examining it, that this was true. They stayed another hour. The room didn't ignore them. There were looks, conversations that paused when they walked near, the social restructuring that happens when something shifts publicly and the community has to figure out where to put the new information. But no one said anything to her face that wasn't civil, whether that was Wyatt's presence or Agnes giving certain women a particular look that Ruby didn't see but heard about later, or simply the weight of what had been said in the middle of the room landing on people in ways they weren't ready to argue with. She couldn't entirely say. Probably all 3. Wyatt spoke with the Hennessy brothers again and sorted out the pasture lease in 20 minutes. He talked with Walt Hendricks about a supply order. He was ordinary and practical and present, which was the thing about him she'd noticed first and trusted most. On the ride home in the dark, she said, "You should know that what you said tonight is going to change things in this town, for both of us." "Things already changed when I walked into Hendricks' General Store," he said. "I made my choice then. I just made it louder tonight." She considered that. "You're a stubborn man." "You're a stubborn woman," he said. "We're suited." The road home ran alongside the river bottom, and the water made a low sound in the dark, and the sky above the ridge was clear and deep and full of stars that the granite blocked only at the edges. She could smell the orchard before she could see it, the particular late-season smell of apples and earth and cold air that she had breathed since she was small enough to walk under the lowest branches without ducking. Home. Still here. Still hers. "The Cortland harvest starts Monday," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll need Dix on the sorting table. He's better than the Dawsons at the quality grading." "I'll tell him. And Fenn needs to be on ladder work this time. He's ready." "All right." She looked at him in the dark, at the silhouette of him on the bay gelding, and thought about what it meant that they could go from that room to this road to the logistics of Monday's harvest in the space of 20 minutes, and that it felt like continuity rather than contradiction. Wyatt, thank you. For tonight. She said it simply because the simple version was the true one. Not for what you said. For the other part. For being there. He was quiet for a moment. You thanked me the first day. In Hendricks. I know. You don't owe me thanks, he said. Not for any of it. I know that too, she said. I'm saying it anyway. The orchard gate came up in the moonlight. She could see the shape of the trees against the sky, the rows she knew by count and by name, the apple-heavy branches that were 3 weeks from harvest and holding everything she needed them to hold. Wyatt dismounted at the gate. He held it open for her, not because she couldn't manage it, but because he was already there, and then stood on the other side of it while she passed through, and the gate swung between them in the dark. Monday, she said. Before light, he said. She walked up to the house. She didn't look back, but she listened, and she heard him stand there a moment longer before she heard him mount up and ride back down the road toward the Tanner Creek Bend and the Double G and his own land. The lamp was still lit in the window. Her father was awake. She could see his shape in the chair and the small orange glow of the lamp behind him, and the sight of it moved through her the way familiar things do when you've been away from them and come back and found them still in place. She went inside. Well? Her father said without turning. She sat down across from him in the other chair and pulled off her boots. It was fine, she said. He turned to look at her. He read her face the way he read the soil. Slowly, precisely, knowing what to look for. Good, he said, and turned back to the window. Outside, the orchard held its darkness and its load of fruit and the quiet sound of the river, and waited. The way land waits, patient and specific and entirely indifferent to everything except what would happen next. The Cortland harvest started Monday as planned, and for 9 days Ruby didn't think about the social or Wyatt's declaration or what any of it meant for the future, because the Cortlands demanded everything she had. They were the most labor-intensive of the 3 main varieties, thinner skinned than the Gravensteins, more sensitive to handling, the kind of apple that bruised if you looked at it wrong and turned soft in storage if the temperature fluctuated even a few degrees in the first week. Her father had always said the Cortlands were where you found out who your people really were, because only the careful ones could pick them right. She'd thought he meant careful with their hands. Now she understood he'd meant careful in their character. Fen on the ladders turned out to be the right call. He'd lost the frenetic edge that had made him a liability in the first weeks and replaced it with something more focused. He moved through the upper canopy with a patience that surprised her, and his count at the end of each day was consistently good. She told him so, briefly, and he nodded like a man who'd been waiting to hear it and had stopped expecting to. The town hadn't forgotten Saturday night. She knew that without being told, in the same way she always knew what Blackridge was thinking without needing to be present for it, through the small adjustments in how people behaved around her when she came into town for supplies. Walt Hendricks was warmer than usual, which meant he approved. Caroline Marsh, who had laughed hardest at Mabel's jokes for years, crossed the street when she saw Ruby coming, which meant she was ashamed, which meant she'd thought about it. Agnes Carr stopped by the orchard on Tuesday with a jar of preserves and spent 20 minutes admiring the Cortland rose before saying anything personal, and what she said was, "You did right on Saturday," and Ruby said, "I don't know what I did," and Agnes said, "You stood in the room, that was the thing," and left. Wyatt was at the orchard every day and said nothing about what had happened between them until the 5th day of the Cortland harvest, when they were eating lunch at the tailgate of the wagon, and he said, without preamble, "I want to be clear about what I meant on Saturday, in case I wasn't." Ruby chewed a piece of bread and waited. "I meant it as a permanent intention," he said. "Not a declaration for the room. I don't say things to perform them." He looked at the orchard rather than at her. "I want to court you properly. If that's something you're willing to consider." She thought about what properly meant to a man like Wyatt Granger, and she thought it probably meant something real rather than something ceremonial. "I'm willing to consider it," she said. He nodded, still looking at the orchard. "That's all I'm asking," he said. They finished lunch and went back to work, and that was the entirety of the conversation, and somehow it was enough. The Empire harvest followed the Cortlands by 10 days, and it was during the Empires that the assessment letter came. Gerald Fitch had done his work. The county assessor's office had reclassified the irrigation infrastructure as a capital improvement, as Wyatt had predicted, and the new taxable valuation had increased the annual tax burden on the Holloway property by an amount that sat in Ruby's stomach like a stone when she read the number. Not catastrophic. Not if the harvest came in as projected and the Helena Agricultural Station paid for the data report she'd submitted and the winter medical costs didn't climb above what she'd budgeted. Not catastrophic, as long as nothing went wrong. She sat with it for 2 days before she told Wyatt. She told him not because she needed him to fix it, but because she'd gotten used to thinking out loud with him, and that was its own kind of risk she'd apparently already accepted without noticing. He read the letter. His jaw did the thing it did when he was controlling his reaction. "The lawyer in Billings," he said. "I wrote to him last week. He says we have grounds to contest the classification if we can document that the infrastructure predates the current ownership improvements threshold. My grandfather put those channels in. The original survey should show it." "Where's the original survey?" "My father's tin box," she said. "I found it last night. The date's there. 1869. Something eased in his expression. "That predates the threshold by 12 years. "Yes." "Then you contest it." "I know." She folded the letter. "I wanted you to know about it, that's all." He looked at her for a moment. "You were going to handle it without telling me." "I was considering it." "Why?" She thought about how to say it honestly. "Because it's my property and my problem, and I'm not used to—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not used to having someone to tell things to. I'm still learning when it's appropriate." He was quiet for a moment, and she couldn't read his expression exactly, but it was something in the neighborhood of careful. "Tell me things," he said. I'd rather know. Even the things you've already handled." She nodded once. "And Ruby," he said, "the assessment. Fitch didn't do this on his own initiative." "I know that." "Harlan Truitt." "Probably." She looked out at the Empire Rose, the deep red of the fruit visible even from where they stood. "But Harlan Truitt can't override an 1869 survey date. Whatever influence he has stops at documentary evidence." Wyatt was still looking at her with that careful expression. "You're not worried." "I'm always worried," she said. "I've been worried since I was 18. You learn to work through the worry, or you stop working, and I haven't stopped working yet." He was quiet for a beat. "No," he said finally. "You haven't." Thomas Holloway had a bad week during the Empire harvest. Not sudden. Nothing with him was sudden anymore. Everything moved in the slow, inescapable direction it had been moving for 2 years. But the coughing increased at night, and he slept more during the day, and the clarity that had always lived in his eyes came and went instead of staying constant. The doctor came out twice. The second time, he spoke to Ruby outside by the gate in a voice low enough that it didn't reach the house window. "I want to be straight with you," he said. He was a young doctor, younger than Ruby had expected when he'd first come to Black Ridge 18 months ago, with the manner of someone still learning how to carry the weight of what he knew. It could be weeks. It could be longer. His constitution is stronger than I'd have predicted at this point, but the direction isn't changing. She listened. "He's not in pain," the doctor said. "I want you to know that. Discomfort, yes, but the breathing, it's labored, but it's not. He's not suffering the way some do." "He told me last month that he wanted to see the full harvest in," she said. The doctor nodded. "Then let him see it." She went back inside and sat with her father until he woke from his afternoon sleep, and when he opened his eyes, she said, "Empire harvest starts in 3 days. Best-looking crop I've seen on those trees." He looked at her with the gray eyes she'd had since childhood, the eyes everyone said she'd gotten from him. "Tell me the sizing." She told him. He listened with his eyes closed, and she thought he'd gone back to sleep. But then he said, "Your mother used to stand in those rows in September. Just stand there. She said she could feel the whole year in the fruit." Ruby didn't say anything. "I used to think that was sentimental," he said. "It took me a long time to understand she was right." He opened his eyes and looked at the window and the orchard beyond it, and his face held something she couldn't have named and didn't try to. The Empire harvest was the biggest of the three. 22 days, with the Double G crew working full shifts through the last week to beat the forecast that was showing a hard frost in the second week of October. The Garrity brothers had been with her long enough now that they worked in a rhythm with the other men that required almost no direction from her, which freed her to make the calls that required judgment, which trees to take early, which to leave another 3 days, how to manage the storage temperatures in the cellar as the outside air dropped. She ran on 4 hours of sleep for the last 5 days. She knew she was doing it, and she did it anyway, because the alternative was leaving fruit on the tree past its window, and she had not spent 6 months working toward this harvest to lose it in the last week to tiredness. Wyatt noticed on the 4th night of the 4-hour stretches. He didn't say she needed to rest because he knew she knew that. He showed up the next morning with a pot of the strongest coffee she'd ever tasted and said, "Dix can run the south section today. I'll take the north with you." And that was the extent of the conversation about it. On the 22nd day, the last Empire came off the last tree at 4:30 in the afternoon, and Ruby stood in the row and looked at the empty branches and the full crates lined up along the wagon road and felt something she had no immediate name for. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. Something that had to do with the specific satisfaction of a thing being done completely. Wyatt was standing 20 feet away, reading her the way he'd learned to read the trees. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She sat down on one of the crates. Her legs simply required it. She sat there for a moment with her forearms on her knees, looking at the ground, and then she started to laugh. Not because anything was funny, but because the body sometimes responds to the end of extreme effort with laughter, and there's nothing to be done about it. Wyatt sat down on the crate across from her, and he smiled, and that smile was a different thing from his usual expressions, unguarded and genuine and making him look briefly like a younger man. "Final numbers?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I'm just—" She gestured. "Tonight you're just—" he agreed. They brought the last wagon in at dusk. Dix and Fenn and the Dawson brothers loaded the final crates into the cellar with the efficiency of men who'd done this same motion enough times that it had become automatic. The Garrity brothers were close behind, quiet and competent and tired in the good way. When the last crate was in, Ruby paid them all in cash, counted out from the envelope she'd prepared that morning from the advance payment she'd received from 3 of her buyers. Dix took his pay and held it a moment and then looked at her. "Good season, Miss Holloway. Best I've worked in a while." "You were the best on the sort table," she said. "By a margin." He nodded, plainly pleased, and didn't make anything more of it. The evening after the crew left was the first genuinely quiet one since early August. Ruby cooked a proper meal, not the fast, functional food she'd been making for months, and sat at the table with her father, who was having one of his clear evenings. And they ate together in the lamplight with the particular ease of people who have known each other long enough that silence between them is comfortable. "The harvest is in," she said. He nodded. He already knew. Dix had told him through the window that afternoon, which was something she hadn't known about until later. Dix stopping by Thomas's window on his way to the cellar and saying, in the even voice he used for everything, "Last crate's going in now, Mr. Holloway. Good fruit. All of it." Her father had apparently said nothing, but Dix told Ruby later, matter-of-factly, that the old man had put his hand briefly on the window glass as he walked away. She didn't cry when Dix told her. She just nodded and thanked him. But she stood in the equipment shed for 2 minutes after, alone, and let herself feel the full weight of what that image was. The letter from the Helena Agricultural Station came the following week, with a payment for the irrigation data report and a request, formally worded, more seriously toned than their previous correspondence, for Ruby to present her water management methodology at the Spring Agricultural Conference in Helena, not as a submitted paper, as a speaker. She read it 3 times. Then she walked to the window and looked at the orchard, stripped of its fruit now, the branches bare against the October sky in the way of apple trees in dormancy, skeletal and unpromising and full of everything that would happen next year. She wrote back and said yes. She told Wyatt that evening. He was at the table going over some paperwork he'd brought from the Double G, the domesticity of which she'd stopped noticing approximately 3 weeks ago, which was its own thing to consider. He looked up from the papers when she told him. He read the letter she handed him. "Helena," he said. "In April." He put the letter down carefully. "Ruby. It's a speaking engagement, not... It's recognition," he said. "From the people who have the credentials to give it. That's what it is." He said it without inflation, just as a fact. "Your father should know." "I was going to tell him tonight." "Tell him now," he said. "Don't wait until tonight." She looked at him. He was right, and she knew he was right, and the knowing of it sat in her chest with a complicated weight, because it had to do with things she couldn't yet say plainly. She went to her father's room. Thomas was awake, in the chair, the lamp low beside him. She sat on the edge of the bed across from him and showed him the letter. He held it with both hands, which trembled now, and read it slowly, the way he read everything these days. When he finished, he sat with it in his lap and didn't say anything for a long moment. "Your mother wrote to that station," he said finally, "when you were 12. Sent them your soil analysis, the one you did on your own." He paused. "They wrote back a form letter." Ruby remembered the letter. She also remembered how her mother had set it on the kitchen table and said, "They'll know your name eventually." She was right, Ruby said. Thomas looked at her. His eyes were clear tonight, all the way clear, and she held that. "She was right about most things," he said. "I didn't always tell her that." He handed the letter back. His hand lingered a moment on her hand as she took it, which was more than he usually permitted himself, and she didn't move quickly. "You'll go," he said. "Yes." "Good." He turned back to the window. "Tell that man of yours to make sure the winter pruning schedule doesn't slip. You'll want good structure going into next season." That man of yours, she hadn't expected that from him in those words, and the particular normality of it. The way he'd folded Wyatt into the working life of the orchard, as if it were already settled, made something ease in her that had been tight for months. "I'll tell him," she said. The contest of the property assessment was filed through the Billings lawyer in late October, with the 1869 survey attached and a detailed accounting of the infrastructure's original installation predating the threshold. The county assessor's office took 3 weeks to respond and then, without fanfare or explanation, withdrew the reclassification and restored the original valuation. She got the letter on a Tuesday morning. She stood at the kitchen table and read it, and then set it down and made coffee, and when Wyatt arrived at 8, she handed it to him without a word. He read it. He said, "Good." "That's all?" she said. "What else is there to say? You had the documentation. The documentation won. That's how it's supposed to work." He set the letter on the table. Harlan Truitt overplayed his hand. "He'll try something else eventually." "Probably," Wyatt said. "And you'll have the documentation for that too." She looked at him. This man who had shown up in her life with a business proposition and stayed for something larger and handled both things with the same steadiness. This man who had sat on her porch step in the dark and looked at her father's orchard like it was worth looking at, who had stood in a room full of people and said her name out loud like it meant something. "I need to ask you something," she said. He waited. "When you came out here in August, when you made the business proposition," she picked her words carefully, "was it already more than that? For you?" He was quiet long enough that she knew he was answering honestly and not quickly. "I thought about you after Hendricks," he said. "I told myself it was because of the orchard, because of what Walt had said about your operation." He looked at his coffee cup. "I knew by Thursday, when you were on the ladder and didn't come down right away. The way you came down." He paused. "I didn't let myself think about it clearly until later." "Why not?" "Because I didn't want to compromise the arrangement," he said. "And because I wasn't sure you'd want to be looked at that way. By anyone." That landed accurately, and she let it. "I didn't," she said. "At first." "I know." "I do now," she said. He looked at her directly. "I know that too." She refilled her coffee and his, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the October morning light, and outside the bare orchard waited in its dormancy, patient and structural, holding all its potential underneath the surface where you had to know how to look to see it. November came in cold and stayed that way. Thomas Holloway declined in the way the doctor had described, not suddenly, but with a direction that didn't change. There were good days and harder days, and Ruby learned to take the good ones for what they were and not to hold them against the harder ones when they came. He was still sharp on his good days. He asked about the pruning schedule, about the grafting stock she was preparing for Wyatt's acreage, about whether she'd heard back from the Helena station about the spring conference agenda. On a Tuesday in the third week of November, he asked her to sit with him. She sat. He didn't say anything for a while. The window showed the orchard in its November state, black branches against pale sky, the shape of the trees she knew better than any other shape in the world. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I wasn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I was not an easy man to have as a father. I know that." He kept his eyes on the window. "I didn't say the right things when I should have said them. Your mother compensated for that, and I let her compensate for it. And when she was gone, He exhaled. "I didn't learn to do better fast enough." Ruby's hands were still in her lap. "You built this," he said. "What this orchard is now. The irrigation, the methodology, the reputation in Helena. That's you. I kept the trees alive. You built something with them." He turned from the window and looked at her, and his eyes were clear and direct and the most present she'd seen them in months. "I should have told you that more. I should have told you that every year." She didn't trust her voice for a moment. "You told me in the ways you knew how," she said. "That's too generous." "No," she said. "It's accurate. You stopped second-guessing me. You let me redesign the channels. You handed me the notebooks." She paused. "You looked at Wyatt Granger and asked him whether he understood what he was dealing with. That was you telling me." He looked at her for a long time. "He does understand," he said finally. "Doesn't he?" "Yes," she said. "He does." Thomas nodded slowly. He turned back to the window. "Good orchard," he said to the trees. "Good trees." She sat with him until he fell asleep, which was an hour later, his breathing slow and even in the lamp-quiet room. He died on a Saturday morning, 12 days later, in early December before the first snow. Ruby was with him. She was holding his hand, and his breathing had changed in the night to a pattern the doctor had told her to listen for, and she'd been awake since 2 o'clock. When it stopped, the room was very still, and the orchard outside the window was still too, bare and waiting and exactly itself. She sat with him for a while. Then she got up and built the fire in the kitchen stove and put water on for coffee because her body needed to do something ordinary. And while the water heated, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the orchard in the first light of the December morning. 40 acres, 3 generations, every channel and graft and pruning cut a form of language she had learned from him and from his notebooks and from the years of watching and failing and adjusting and trying again. She heard the horse on the road before she'd decided to send for anyone. Wyatt pulled up at the gate and dismounted, and she didn't ask how he knew. She thought maybe he'd seen the lamp on at an unusual hour from the road. Or maybe it was something else, something that couldn't be explained except by saying that some people pay attention in ways that amount to a kind of knowing. He came through the gate and up to the door and knocked twice, soft, and she opened it. He looked at her face. He didn't ask. He came in and stood in the kitchen, and she poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat at the table together in the early December light, and outside the orchard held its winter shape against the sky, and she let herself grieve without performing the grief for anyone, and that was possible because of who was sitting across from her, and that was its own kind of thing to know. The funeral was small and plain, the way Thomas Holloway had requested in the letter Ruby found in the tin box beside the survey documents. Agnes Carr came. The Garrity brothers. Dix and Fenn and the Dawsons, Walt Hendricks, Roy Hennessy. Wyatt stood beside Ruby, and she led him. Afterward, when everyone had gone and the house was quiet, she went to her father's chair by the window and sat in it for the first time. She'd never sat in it before. It was positioned exactly right to see the whole orchard from the easternmost row to the westernmost, the full span of it, framed by the window like a painting that changed with every season. She understood, sitting there, why he'd spent so much of his last years looking at it. She sat in the chair for a long time. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went out to walk the rows, because the winter pruning schedule needed to be assessed and planned, and the grafting stock for Wyatt's acreage needed to be cataloged before the ground froze hard, and the Helena conference was in April and she had work to prepare. The orchard was hers now, fully and completely, with everything that meant. She walked the first row in the cold morning air, her breath visible, her boots on the frozen ground making the sound she'd heard all her life, and she put her hand on the bark of the nearest Gravenstein the way her father used to do, just resting it there, feeling the tree, neither sentimental nor unsentimental about it, just present. The tree was dormant and solid and entirely alive underneath. She moved to the next one. The winter pruning took 6 weeks. Ruby had always done it with her father's guidance before. He would sit by the window, and she would come in at midday and describe what she'd found, and he would tell her what he would do, and she would go back out and do it. And sometimes she'd agree with him, and sometimes she wouldn't. And the conversation between them had been the real work, the living transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. Now there was no midday conversation. There was just her and the trees and the notebooks, and she had to trust that what she'd absorbed over 24 years was enough. It was enough. She knew it was enough, knowing it didn't make the silence any easier. Wyatt came out 3 times a week through December and January, sometimes to work and sometimes just to be there. And he had the intelligence not to fill the silence with unnecessary talk. He learned in those winter months when she wanted conversation and when she wanted company without it, and he adjusted accordingly without being asked, which was a kind of attentiveness she hadn't known she needed until she had it. He brought her a book in January, not as a gift with ceremony, so he just left it on the kitchen table one morning and said nothing about it. It was an agricultural text from the university in Minnesota, a new edition with a chapter on high-density orchard systems that she'd mentioned once, weeks ago, in passing. She hadn't thought he'd been listening particularly. She read it in 3 nights and left it on the table with 3 pages of her own notes folded inside. And when he came the next morning and found the notes, he read them carefully and then said, "You disagree with the density recommendation." "For river-bottom soil in this climate, yes," she said. "The Minnesota model assumes different drainage." "Write that up," he said. "For Helena." She already had. The Helena Agricultural Conference was in the 2nd week of April, and the months between Thomas's death and the conference were the longest Ruby had spent largely alone in her own head. There was work, always work, the winter pruning, the grafting stock preparation, the planning for next season's expansion into 2 new Gravenstein blocks that she'd been considering for 3 years and now had the acreage cleared to attempt. There were the financial accounts to settle, the property deed to transfer officially into her name, the small and procedural machinery of inheritance that turned out to require more paperwork than she'd expected and less emotion than she'd feared. There was grief, running underneath all of it like the irrigation channels ran under the orchard, not always visible, but always present, shaping everything above it. She didn't talk about the grief much. She wasn't built for that kind of talking, and she'd learned to be suspicious of the kind of processing that required an audience. But she felt it in the mornings, when she reached the kitchen and the chair by the window was empty. She felt it in the evenings, when she finished the harvest logs and had no one to read the numbers to. She felt it in the orchard, in the way the trees that her father had grafted with his own hands in 1974 looked in the February light, sturdy and silent and indifferent to what they'd witnessed. One evening in late January, Wyatt stayed past dark, which he didn't usually do, and they sat at the table long after dinner was finished, and she said, without planning to, "I keep reaching for things to tell him." He looked up from the papers he'd been reviewing. "Specific things," she said. "Yesterday, the grafting wax from Billings came in, and it was a new formulation I hadn't used before, and my first thought was that I needed to ask him if he'd seen it." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "He probably wouldn't have known. He hadn't been to town in 2 years, but the reaching is still there." "It stays for a long time," Wyatt said. His voice had the quality of someone speaking from experience rather than from intention to comfort. "Your wife?" "Yes." He looked at the table. 3 years before I stopped turning to say things to an empty room." He paused. "Then I moved the furniture around. I don't know why that helped. It just did." She thought about that. I'm not moving his chair. No, he said. I didn't mean it as advice. The reaching. You're right that it stays. Does it stop eventually? He looked at her honestly. It changes, he said. I can't say it stops. She nodded. That was the right answer. She'd have trusted it less if he'd told her it stopped. She sat the chair in the same place. She didn't move anything. But gradually, across February and March, the reaching shifted. Not from reaching to not reaching, but from reaching for something lost to reaching for something that was still there in a different form. She'd pick up a notebook and feel him in the handwriting. She'd make a decision about a tree and know, with a certainty she couldn't fully explain, that she'd made it the way he would have, or better, which was what he'd have wanted. She stopped reaching for the man and started reaching for what he'd given her, and the grief changed shape the way Wyatt had said it would, and she was able to carry it differently. March brought the cataloging work for the Helena presentation, data compilation, methodology documentation, the irrigation schematics she'd need to illustrate the water management system. She did this at the kitchen table in the evenings, and it was absorbing work, technical and precise, the kind that quieted the other parts of her mind. Wyatt looked over her presentation materials one evening and said, "This is more sophisticated than what they're expecting." "I know," she said. "Should I simplify it?" He thought about it genuinely. "No," he said. "They invited you because of the quality of your work. Present the quality of your work. They may not be expecting it from someone like me." He met her eyes. "No," he said. "They probably aren't. That's exactly why you don't simplify it." She hadn't needed him to say that. She'd already decided. But she was glad he'd said it. The morning she left for Helena, she stood at the orchard gate for a moment before she got into the wagon. The April light was the pale early kind that didn't commit to warmth yet, and the trees were just breaking dormancy. The first small leaves barely visible at the bud tips, the whole orchard on the edge of its annual return. She'd planted a new row of grafted Gravensteins the previous week, the first of the expansion she'd been planning. They were just sticks in the ground right now, but the rootstock was good, and the union sites were clean, and in 3 years they'd be bearing. Wyatt was driving her to the station at Billings, which was a half-day ride. He'd arranged for the Garrity brothers to check the new plantings while she was away. They didn't talk much on the road. She was going over the presentation in her head, and he knew that, and let her. Halfway to Billings, he said, "You're not nervous." "I'm nervous," she said. "I'm just not showing it." "What are you nervous about?" She thought about it. "That they'll listen politely and then go back to doing things the way they've always done them," she said. "That the information won't change anything." "Maybe it won't," he said. "At first." "That's not reassuring." "I'm not trying to reassure you," he said. "I'm trying to be accurate. The first time you tell people something they haven't considered, they listen politely. The second time, a few of them remember. By the third time, someone's already implemented it and is telling other people it works." He kept his eyes on the road. "You're not going to Helena to change everything in one afternoon. You're going to plant something." She looked at him. "You know about planting things," he said. She turned back to the road ahead. "Yes," she said. "I do." The Helena conference was held in a building attached to the state agricultural offices, a long, high-ceilinged room with windows along one side and rows of chairs, and the particular smell of rooms where serious men conduct serious business, which was a combination of tobacco and paper and something chemical she couldn't identify. There were 43 people in the room when she walked in. She counted, because counting was a way of managing the moment. 39 men, 3 women, all of whom appeared to be there as companions to the men beside them. And Ruby, the man from the station who'd corresponded with her, a Dr. Emmett Crane, 50s, with the distracted energy of someone whose mind was always slightly ahead of his body, found her near the door and shook her hand with genuine enthusiasm. "Miss Holloway, the irrigation paper caused quite a discussion." Quite a discussion. Rollins from the Bozeman office wrote 3 pages of objections. He said this as if 3 pages of objections was the highest compliment available. "What were the objections?" she said. He told her accurately and specifically, and she was ready for all of them. She presented after lunch, which was the slot she'd been given, which was not the most prestigious slot, but was better than the morning slot when people's attention was still arriving. She stood at the front of the room with her schematics on the board beside her and looked at 43 faces and felt the specific quality of the room's attention, calibrating, uncertain, polite in the way that was really a form of waiting. She spoke for 40 minutes. She presented the data without softening it and explained the methodology without simplifying it. And when the Rollins from the Bozeman office asked his 3 pages worth of objections in compressed form, she answered each one directly and specifically, and watched his expression move from challenge to resistance to something that was grudging and genuine and close to interest. Afterward, 4 men came to speak with her. 2 asked questions she answered. 1 asked for a copy of the schematics, which she provided, having brought copies. The 4th, a younger man, maybe 30, who introduced himself as a second-generation orchardist from the Flathead Valley, said, "I've been struggling with exactly this problem for 2 years. Everything you described. The evaporation loss, the mineral uptake issue in dry years." He stopped. "I didn't know anyone else had solved it." "I didn't solve it entirely," she said. "I solved it for my soil and my climate. You'll need to adapt the gradient calculations for your terrain." "Can I write to you?" "Yes," she said. He wrote down her address carefully, like he was afraid of losing it. She came back from Helena in the 2nd week of April to an orchard that had opened fully into spring while she was gone. The new leaves full out, the blossom buds swelling on the bearing trees, the whole property transformed in the specific and reliable way of fruit trees in April that never quite stopped feeling like something more than biology. Wyatt was at the orchard when she arrived. He'd been checking the new plantings, which was what he'd said he'd do, and he came to the gate when he heard the wagon. He helped her down with one hand and held her traveling bag with the other and said, "How was it?" "Rollins from the Bozeman office asked 17 questions," she said. "Hostile?" "At first." She looked at the orchard. By the end, he was writing things down. Wyatt's expression did what it did when he was pleased, but not making a production of it. "The new Gravensteins look good," he said. "No losses." "All 17 took?" "All 17. The Garrities kept the moisture right." She looked at the trees, the small sticks that were no longer quite sticks, the first leaves catching the April light, the entire future of the expanded block visible in microcosm. 17 for 17 was better than she'd planned for. "Good," she said. They stood at the gate in the April morning, and the orchard did what the orchard did in spring, which was to make every difficult winter feel, briefly, like it had been preparation rather than simply endurance, and she let herself feel that without arguing with it. Wyatt proposed on a Thursday evening in May at the kitchen table, which was the most practical location she could have imagined and exactly right for the 2 of them. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He had a ring, a plain one, gold, without decoration, and he set it on the table between them and said, "I want to marry you. I've wanted to since February, and I've been trying to find the right moment, and I've come to understand there isn't a right moment. There's just the question." He looked at her directly. "Will you?" She looked at the ring and then at him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He almost smiled. "Obviously. You've been building up to this since February, and I've been watching you not say it for 3 months, she said. I was beginning to think I'd have to say something myself. You could have, he said. I know, she said. I wanted to see if you'd get there. He picked up the ring and held it out, and she gave him her hand, and he put it on with the same careful attention he gave everything, and it fit, which meant he'd figured out her size somehow, which meant he'd been planning longer than February, and she decided not to ask him about that because some things were better left as they were. They were married in June, beneath the oldest apple tree in the orchard, the Gravenstein her grandfather had planted in 1861, the one that had outlasted every hard winter and dry summer and blight year the territory had produced, its trunk thicker than Ruby could get her arms around, its canopy wide enough to shade 20 people. Agnes Carr stood with Ruby. Dick stood with Wyatt, which surprised some people and not others. It was not a large wedding. It was not intended to be. The people who came were the people who had been there through the actual events of the preceding year. The Garrity brothers, the Dawsons and Fenn, Walt Hendricks, Roy Hennessy and his wife, the young orchardist from the Flathead Valley who had written 3 letters since Helena and driven 2 days to be there, Agnes, the doctor who had taken care of Thomas and said, when Ruby invited him, that he wouldn't miss it. The ceremony was short and plain, and nobody cried except Fen, who was unapologetic about it. What Ruby remembered afterward, when she thought about that day, was not the ceremony or the meal that followed or the particular quality of the June light, though all of those things were real and present. What she remembered was the moment afterward, when the guests had dispersed across the orchard, and she was standing at the base of her grandfather's tree with Wyatt beside her, and the sound of other people's voices coming from a comfortable distance. And she put her hand on the bark the way her father had, and she felt, not happiness exactly, though that was there too, she felt continuity. The specific sense of being one point in a long line that ran backward through her father and grandfather and forward into something she couldn't see yet but could feel the direction of. She thought about what it means to belong somewhere, not in the way that's granted to you by birth or title or the approval of other people, but in the way that's built, day by day, decision by decision, through the accumulation of work that has your name on it and the willingness to stay when staying is hard. Her grandfather had broken 40 acres of river-bottom clay and called it home. Her father had kept it alive through 30 years of difficulty and called it home. She had rebuilt it from the inside out, had remade it into something that could outlast its own history and called it home. She had not needed Black Ridge to grant her that. She had made it herself. That was the thing nobody tells you, she thought. They tell you that belonging is something you find or something you earn through other people's recognition. They don't tell you that the most durable kind is the kind you build out of your own work, in the ground you've chosen to stand on, with the people you've chosen to stand beside. "What are you thinking?" Wyatt said, beside her. "About what my grandfather would think of all this," she said. "Probably that you overextended on the new Gravenstein block." She laughed. "A real one, the kind that came without warning. He would have said exactly that." And he would have been wrong," she said. "The new block's going to be the best thing I've done." Wyatt looked at the orchard with the particular expression she'd come to know as his equivalent of a smile. "Yes," he said, "it is." The years after that were not easy years in the uncomplicated sense. Easy years don't exist on working land in a variable climate, and Ruby had never expected them to. What they were was full in the way of a life that has direction and purpose and enough difficulty to make the good parts mean something. The new Gravenstein block came into bearing in its third year and produced exactly what she'd predicted, which vindicated the expansion decision in the way that only results can vindicate. She planted a Honeycrisp trial block in the 5th year, using grafting techniques she'd developed partly from her father's notebooks and partly from her own experimentation, and the Flathead orchardist, whose name was Daniel Marsh, no relation to the Caroline Marsh who had laughed in Hendrick's general store, a coincidence Ruby found grimly amusing, came to observe the grafting methodology and went home and applied it and wrote to her that it had worked. She began presenting at the Helena conference regularly. Not every year. There were harvest years when she couldn't leave, and years when she had nothing new enough to say to be worth the trip, but often enough that her name became something the agricultural station's correspondents referenced in a certain way. Dr. Crane retired in the 6th year, and his replacement, a woman from the university in Missoula named Dr. Adeline Park, wrote to Ruby in her first month in the position and said she'd read every piece of Ruby's submitted work and considered it among the most practically rigorous material in the station's files. Ruby wrote back a thank you that was shorter than Dr. Park deserved, and longer than she usually managed for correspondence, and they maintained a productive working relationship for years afterward. Wyatt's acreage under cultivation expanded in the 3rd year, using rootstock and methodology directly from the Holloway orchard, and by the 5th year the Double G had the most productive small orchard operation in the northern part of the county. He was not a natural orchardist. He had the patience, but not the instinct, and there were decisions he still brought to her rather than making alone, which he did without embarrassment and which she respected. What he was a good learner who stayed a good learner, which was rarer than it should have been. Their first child was born in the 2nd year of their marriage, a daughter, which neither of them had specifically expected or planned for, though Ruby understood that expectation and planning had limited application to children. They named her Clara, after Ruby's mother, which was Wyatt's suggestion and which Ruby accepted without ceremony, and with a gratitude she wasn't able to express in proportion to what she felt. Clara was, from the beginning, a child with strong opinions about everything, expressed at volume. She walked early and had talked earlier, and by the time she was 4, she had figured out that the orchard was the most interesting place on the property and had appointed herself assistant to whatever Ruby was doing in it, which created complications and occasionally disasters, and was, fundamentally, the best thing that happened to Ruby's working days. She pulled 3 of the training wires out of the young Honey Crisps, Ruby told Wyatt one evening in the tone of someone reporting both damage and delight. Was she experimenting or being destructive? She told me she was seeing if they'd stand up on their own. Wyatt thought about this. That's a reasonable hypothesis. She's 4. She's your daughter, he said. What did you expect? The second child, Chas, a boy, James, after Wyatt's father, arrived 3 years after Clara, quieter and more deliberate and more like Wyatt in the way he observed things before engaging with them. He didn't take to the orchard the way Clara did. He was more interested in the cattle, in the long sight lines of the grazing land, in the way the double G operated at its scale. Ruby found this interesting rather than disappointing. The orchard had always been about the people who were drawn to it, not the people who were obligated to it. Clara, at 7, could identify every variety in the orchard by leaf shape alone. Ruby had not taught her this directly. She had simply been present while Ruby walked the rows and named what she saw. And Clara had absorbed it the way children absorb everything, effortlessly and completely, filing it in the part of her mind that was already, visibly, organizing itself around the same things Ruby's mind had organized itself around at the same age. Thomas Holloway's notebooks were in the kitchen bookshelf now, lined up in order. Ruby had made clean copies of the most deteriorated ones, preserving the content while the originals continued to fade. Clara had asked about them once, carefully, the way she asked about things she considered important. Can I read them? When you can read cursive, Ruby said. Clara learned cursive in 6 months, which was faster than the school's standard timeline, driven by a motivation that had nothing to do with schoolwork. The notebooks were not easy reading. Thomas's handwriting was compressed and technical and assumed a body of knowledge that Clara didn't have yet. Ruby read sections with her and explained what they meant. It was the same relationship Ruby had had with the notebooks as a child, mediated by her father, and sitting at the kitchen table with her daughter and her father's handwriting around them, she felt the continuity again. That sense of a line running forward and backward simultaneously, the orchard and the knowledge of the orchard passing from one set of hands to the next. She didn't romanticize it. There were days when Clara was difficult, and the orchard had problems, and Wyatt and Ruby disagreed about something operational, and the disagreement didn't resolve cleanly, and those days were real too. Marriage is not a resolution, she had come to understand. It's a practice. You have to practice it the same way you practice grafting or pruning or any skilled work, with attention and adjustment and the willingness to be wrong and try again. They were wrong about things sometimes. They argued about the expansion pace, about labor costs, about how much Ruby should be traveling to the Helena conferences versus managing the peak season work herself. Wyatt had been right about some of those arguments and wrong about others, and so had she. And the record of who was right when was less important than the pattern underneath it, which was that neither of them stopped engaging, neither of them stopped telling the truth, neither of them confused being right with being good. Her mother had told her once that a partnership is only as strong as the honesty inside it. Ruby had been 12 and had not fully understood what she meant. She understood it now. Black Ridge changed around them in the way of frontier towns when a fixed social order meets a sustained challenge to it, slowly, unevenly, with pockets of resistance that held longer than made sense and pockets of acceptance that came sooner than expected. Mabel Truitt remained Mabel Truitt. She never apologized, and nobody expected her to. But the particular cruelty of those general store performances diminished over time, partly because Ruby was no longer a solitary target, and partly because the social math had changed. When a woman is known by reputation in Helena and her husband controls the largest cattle operation in the county, the cost of public cruelty recalculates. Ruby noticed this without satisfaction, not because she was above satisfaction, but because the approval of people who had not changed their characters but only their calculations wasn't the kind of approval she'd ever been seeking. Judge Harlan Truitt died in the 7th year of a heart condition that had apparently been building for a long time. His administrative pressure on the water rights and the property assessment had never successfully materialized into anything that stuck, partly because Ruby and Wyatt had been meticulous about documentation, and partly because Truitt had made enough enemies by that point that his moves were watched and countered quickly. She attended his funeral because that was the civil thing to do, and she was capable of doing civil things even for people who had wished her harm. Mabel, at the funeral, looked at Ruby across the room with an expression that Ruby had spent years trying to classify. It wasn't remorse, she was certain of that. It was something more complex, something that might have been the beginning of a recognition that had taken too long to arrive. They didn't speak. There was nothing that needed saying that either of them was prepared to say. Walt Hendricks retired in the 8th year and sold the general store to a younger man who had no history in Black Ridge and treated every customer with the same neutral efficiency. Ruby found she missed the particular unease of Hendricks' general store, which surprised her until she thought about it clearly. The store had been the site of the worst of it, yes, but it had also been the site of the beginning of everything that came after. She was not sure she would have chosen any of it differently, which was a strange thing to sit with and a true one. Agnes Carr stayed in Black Ridge and stayed the schoolteacher and stayed, throughout all of it, the most sensible person in the county, which was a contribution to the territory as significant as anything Ruby had done with the orchard, in a different register. They had Sunday dinners together several times a year, Agnes and Ruby and Wyatt, and whoever Agnes had brought back from her own complicated history, which was a subject of separate depth. Those evenings were among the ones Ruby kept. The Flathead orchardist, Daniel Marsh, came twice more to observe the orchard methodology, and both times he brought someone with him. Other growers, younger ones, people who'd heard about the irrigation work through the Helena station's increasingly wide correspondence. Ruby showed them what she knew without reservation, because her grandfather's approach to horticultural knowledge had been to hold it closely, and it had died with him, and she had spent years reconstructing what had been lost, and she had no intention of allowing the same loss to happen again. She wrote the irrigation methodology up properly in the 10th year. Not an article for the Helena Station's bulletin, which she'd already done, but a full practical manual with schematics and soil-type variants and the seasonal adjustment tables she'd developed over a decade of modification. Dr. Park at the station had been asking for it for 3 years. Ruby had been waiting until it was complete enough to be worth the paper. It was 112 pages, handwritten first and then typed with the help of Clara, who was 12 by that point and could type faster than Ruby, and didn't make her feel bad about this. "Is this everything Grandpa Thomas wrote in his notebooks?" Clara asked, partway through the typing. "No," Ruby said. "His notebooks are in there too, but what I've added is more than what he had. We went further." Clara considered this, her hands still on the keys. "Because of the extra data years?" "Because of the extra data years, and the new varieties, and what I learned from the Flathead methodology, and some things I figured out by being wrong and fixing it." Ruby paused. "Knowledge compounds if you share it and let other people add to it. Your great-grandfather kept his to himself. I understand why. It doesn't change the result." Clara started typing again. She was quiet for a moment and then said, without stopping, "I want to add to it when I know enough." Ruby looked at her daughter. This child who had pulled training wires at 4 and read cursive at 7 and was now typing a horticultural manual at 12 with the matter-of-fact intent of someone who had already decided what her life was going to be about. "You will," Ruby said. The manual was published, distributed really through the station, in the spring of the 11th year. The response was quieter than Ruby had expected, and then, over the following 18 months, louder. Letters from orchardists in 3 territories, a request from the Montana State Agricultural Board to present at a conference of a larger and more official variety than the Helena Station's annual gathering. A mention in a bulletin from the University in Missoula that Dr. Park sent to Ruby with a brief handwritten note at the top that said only, "Well done," and which Ruby kept. She was 35 years old when the manual was published. She felt, in the way that honest accounting sometimes produces, both older and younger than that simultaneously. Older because of everything that had happened, younger because she could see now that the work had not peaked, that it was still in its middle chapters, that the expanded orchard and the new varieties and Clara's future relationship with the land and the knowledge that was passing through them all was still in motion. The afternoon the letter from the state board arrived, she was in the orchard with Clara, walking the Honeycrisp block. Clara was pointing out a branch she thought needed attention, correctly, as it turned out, and Ruby was explaining the pruning decision while also watching how Clara's hands moved near the tree, already developing the instinct. Wyatt came across the field with the letter and handed it to her without ceremony. She read it. Clara was watching her face. Good news or complicated news? Ruby looked at her daughter. Is there a difference anymore? Clara thought about it seriously. Complicated news is usually bigger, she said. Then complicated news, Ruby said, and handed her the letter. Clara read it quickly. She was a fast reader, always had been, and looked up. You're going to say yes? Yes. And you'll be in Helena for 2 weeks. Probably. Clara handed the letter back. I can manage the Honeycrisp irrigation while you're gone, she said. I know the adjustment schedule. Ruby looked at her daughter in the afternoon light of the orchard, 12 years old and already standing in the trees the way Thomas Holloway had stood in them, and the way Ruby stood in them, with that particular quality of attention that is neither sentimental nor clinical, but something of both. The attention of someone who has decided that this place and this work matter, and is prepared to act accordingly. I know you can, Ruby said. That evening, after Clara and James were in bed and the orchard had gone quiet in the way it did in the spring evenings, Ruby and Wyatt sat on the porch in the cooling air, not talking much. They'd been married 11 years and had arrived at the particular ease of people who don't need to fill space between them, who can sit in silence and have it be a form of closeness rather than a form of distance. The oldest Gravenstein, her grandfather's tree, was visible from the porch in the dusk, its shape familiar as a face. The new blocks extended beyond it, the ordered rows of the Honeycrisps and the second Gravenstein expansion and the small trial block of a new variety she was working with that might come to nothing or might be the best thing she'd planted in a decade. She thought about Mabel Truitt's face in Hendrick's General Store, a long time ago. The quality of that laughter, the way it had sat in her chest like a stone she'd carried for so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it until it was gone. She thought about her father's hand on the window glass as Dix walked past, the day the last Empire came off the trees. She thought about standing in the Black Ridge Community Hall in her mother's green dress, with Wyatt's hand finding hers in front of everyone who had ever decided she was worth less than she was. She thought about what it costs to stand in a room where no one wants you and refuse to leave. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a declaration or any of the performed courage that other people would have described to her if she'd asked them what courage looked like. Just the daily, unspectacular, non-negotiable decision to keep being present in your own life, to keep doing the work, to keep knowing what you know. That was the thing they didn't put in the agricultural manuals or the conference presentations or the Helena Station bulletins. The technical knowledge mattered. It mattered enormously. It was the work. It was the reason anything grew. But underneath it was something simpler and harder than technique, which was the willingness to believe that your knowledge was worth having and your work was worth doing and your presence was worth maintaining, even when the room around you was laughing. She hadn't always believed that. She had learned to believe it through the same process she'd learned everything else. By doing it imperfectly, by being wrong about some of it, by adjusting, by continuing. Wyatt said, into the quiet, the state board presentation, "Are you ready for that kind of visibility?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but I'll be ready when I get there." He nodded. That was the right answer for both of them. The orchard settled into its evening sounds around them. The small movements of the trees in the light wind, the water in the channels at their low nighttime flow. The whole 40 acres of it in its spring readiness, everything it needed in the ground and in the work already done and in the hands that would tend it next. Her grandfather's tree stood at the center of it, the oldest and largest thing on the property, its roots running deeper than anyone had ever measured because no one had thought to measure them, just trusted them to hold. She was still that tree's descendant. She was also its continuation, and the continuation extended beyond her, into Claire's hands already learning the angle of a pruning cut, into Daniel Marsh's flathead orchard running the irrigation gradient she'd calculated, into the pages of the manual sitting in the station files, into the letters from orchardists in 3 territories who had read her work and gone back to their own land and tried something differently. You cannot make people see you. She knew that now, fully and finally. You cannot make them recognize what you're worth, or correct their own cruelty, or arrive at a fair assessment of your capacities. You can only do the work so thoroughly and for long enough that the evidence becomes impossible to ignore, and even then some people will ignore it. And that has to be acceptable because the alternative is making your own validity conditional on their recognition. And that is a condition you will never fully meet and will spend your life chasing. Her mother had known this. She'd tried to tell Ruby, in the way of parents who know things their children can only understand after they've lived them. She understood it now. The wind moved through the orchard in the last of the evening light, and the trees moved with it, and Ruby sat on the porch of the farmhouse that was hers, and watched the land that was hers, and felt beside her the presence of the man who had chosen to stand next to her when standing next to her had cost something, and she thought that this, all of this, had not been given to her. She had built it. Every irrigation channel and grafting union and hard winter and contested assessment and public humiliation survived, and Helena presentation and difficult harvest and year of grief and morning of doubt that she'd gotten up through anyway. All of it was the material. All of it was what the building was made of. The orchard was 40 acres of river-bottom clay that her grandfather had broken with his hands. It was also 60 years of knowledge passing from one generation to the next and then beyond, out into the territory and the stations and the correspondence and the young orchardist from the Flathead who would one day pass it to someone else. It was hers. It would outlast her. Both things were true, and neither diminished the other. She sat with Wyatt in the darkening evening and let the orchard be what it was, and she let herself be what she was, and the two things fit together the way good rootstock fits its graft. Not because they were identical, but because the union had been made carefully, and the cambium had lined up, and the season had been tended, and the result, over time, was something that bore fruit. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. She was still that tree's descendant. She was also its continuation. And the continuation extended beyond her, into Claire's hands already learning the angle of a pruning cut, into Daniel Marsh's flathead orchard running the irrigation gradient she'd calculated, into the pages of the manual sitting in the station files, into the letters from orchardists in 3 territories who had read her work and gone back to their own land and tried something differently. You cannot make people see you. She knew that now, fully and finally. You cannot make them recognize what you're worth, or correct their own cruelty, or arrive at a fair assessment of your capacities. You can only do the work so thoroughly and for long enough that the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. And even then, some people will ignore it. And that has to be acceptable because the alternative is making your own validity conditional on their recognition, and that is a condition you will never fully meet and will spend your life chasing. Her mother had known this. She'd tried to tell Ruby, in the way of parents who know things their children can only understand after they've lived them. She understood it now. The wind moved through the orchard in the last of the evening light, and the trees moved with it, and Ruby sat on the porch of the farmhouse that was hers and watched the land that was hers and felt beside her the presence of the man who had chosen to stand next to her when standing next to her had cost something, and she thought that this, all of this, had not been given to her. She had built it. Every irrigation channel and grafting union and hard winter and contested assessment and public humiliation survived, and Helena presentation and difficult harvest and year of grief and morning of doubt that she'd gotten up through anyway. All of it was the material. All of it was what the building was made of. The orchard was 40 acres of river-bottom clay that her grandfather had broken with his hands. It was also 60 years of knowledge passing from one generation to the next, and then beyond, out into the territory and the stations, and the correspondence and the young orchardist from the Flathead who would one day pass it to someone else. It was hers. It would outlast her. Both things were true, and neither diminished the other. She sat with Wyatt in the darkening evening and let the orchard be what it was. And she let herself be what she was. And the two things fit together the way good rootstock fits its graft. Not because they were identical, but because the union had been made carefully, and the cambium had lined up, and the season had been tended, and the result over time was something that bore fruit. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.